Banpresto asked the question, what would a chibified version of this monster look like? Their answer? Today we're taking a look at the Godzilla Toho Monster Series Enshrined Monsters Godzilla Minus One figure. So, this figure is based on Godzilla's appearance from Godzilla Minus One. Ever since this figure was announced quite a while back, I instantly pre-ordered it because I was so excited to get my hands on a chibified version of what has come to be one of my favorite Godzilla designs. So, after months of waiting, I'm happy to say that this figure is a great release from Banpresto. If you followed my channel for any amount of time, you know that I love stylized figures, especially ones that chibify kaiju. When it comes to the sculpt, we're looking at a highly stylized and condensed version of Godzilla. Now, while this figure may be small, it certainly captures all the gnarly details that are present on this version of Godzilla. As I pan throughout this figure, you'll see all the varying textures that are present, all the way from the toes, the legs, the torso. The whole thing is just so mesmerizing to me. This is very much akin to X Plus Deferils, though not exactly on that same level. It's close, but for the price point, I cannot complain. This is a really detailed figure that perfectly captures that sort of mean look that Godzilla has in Godzilla Minus One, but of course, with that chibi style, does add that sort of cuteness to it that reminds me of like an angry dog. Taking a look at this head sculpt, they capture the likeness of Godzilla very well as he appears in the movie. Now, of course, he has a very angry expression on his face with those furrowed brows, but it's a little hard to take him seriously with how cute this figure really is. I think this figure is a great example of what a chibified toy can be, because while it clearly is Godzilla, it has these elements to it that are very whimsical and just kind of put a smile on my face, and this is why I like this figure so much. And despite being very condensed in this small figure format, I do think that it is very photogenic, and you'll see at these different angles that I've shot in different natural light settings, how it really does feel like Godzilla's kind of looking head on, and it captures the sense of life in this figure. It has a lot of personality to it. But in terms of the sculpt, as we look throughout the head here, you'll see all this wonderful texture, from the snout to the brows, the eyes, and like the top of the head here where you have these different sort of scales that feed into the dorsals on his back. There's a lot going on here, but they capture it very well. The sculpt is a little bit soft overall, but far from bad at all. This is, I think, a very good sculpt for about a $27, $28 figure. This is almost on the level, I would say, of a Deferil. It doesn't have that quality like a Deferil. It definitely feels a little bit cheaper. The plastic isn't as heavy feeling, if that makes sense. And the sculpt, like I said, is a little bit soft. There are some visible seams that I'll point out a little bit later. None of this, to me, really detracts from the figure. Like I said, pre-ordering this thing knowing it's about $28, I kind of knew what to expect, but I'm not disappointed at all. And as we work our way through the body here, you can see, again, all this texture that is present on this figure. It looks exceptional, and I think you can see in these different lighting conditions how, just like the best of Godzilla figures, I think light and shadow really do play a part in bringing out the sculpt. And I think the pose here is exceptional. It really brings this figure to life. It kind of feels like Godzilla is kind of stepping forward. His hands are very grabby. That one on the left is raised a little higher than the one on the right, kind of implying this walking motion, which is sold very well through this figure. The actual pose itself kind of reminds me of this particular shot from the movie. Again, I'm kind of recalling from memory, so I don't exactly remember if this is based on a specific shot, maybe from the Ginza attack in the film. Front facing, you can really get a sense of the proportions of this figure. Like I said, very condensed, especially in the leg area. You basically just have thighs and feet. There is no in between, no knees or ankles or anything, which makes him very stubby looking, but it's funny. And it works well. I think it fits perfectly, obviously, with this style, but it doesn't feel like anything's missing. And that's the thing that's interesting to me about, I think, chibi figures done well, is that, technically speaking, like I said, there are no knees or ankles here, but they're implied, and it looks correct. It fits very well for this, and it looks awesome. The arms are pretty proportional, I would say, to the rest of the figure, but it's really that leg, torso, lower pelvic section that's all kind of crunched in all together, but it looks fantastic. Working your way to the back of the figure is where you see the rest of the detail come through, with of course the dorsal plates and the tail. I really like this pose for the tail because it does give this sense of motion with it swinging. It is much more leaning to the right side of Godzilla, so you can't really see it if you look at the figure from the left-hand side. And it is a little bit short, so it can be hard to see at some angles, but that doesn't detract from the figure at all for me. Like I said, I love this pose. Sense of motion, makes a figure feel like it's not so static. Then when going to the dorsal plates, the detail is a little bit on the soft side, but it does get the point across, and it feeds in nicely with the rest of the detail from the top of the head working its way back into the dorsals, as well as the varying texture that's present on the back of Godzilla as well. So the overall sculpt is great. And moving over to the paint now, this is that next element that really elevates this existing sculpt. You have some beautiful colors that are subtly done, but much like the movie, kind of add these little bits of variation in what is otherwise one consistent deep charcoal color. From what I understand, I think that these lighter colors are meant to represent areas of skin and muscle or tissue that's been regenerated in Godzilla, so it kind of comes across as a lighter, more fresh skin, if that makes sense. So the final product that I have here, compared to the prototype images from Banpresto prior to the figure's release, definitely has some variation in the paint. I do think that the prototype images had them in a much more consistently beige tone over that charcoal that was present. Of course, we're not going for screen accuracy with such a stylized figure, but I do think that the final product is closer to what Godzilla looked like in the film. There were points with the prototype pictures where he almost looked like a wooden sculpture because it was more brown and beige compared to this much darker gray with variations of green and maybe some beige there, but it's much more subtle. And you can see in this footage here the color variations throughout the entirety of the figure. I do think my favorite implementation of that color variation is on the left cheek of the figure, right under that left eye, which I think is supposed to represent, spoiler alert, when Godzilla's face, literally that portion gets blown off and regenerates. And like I mentioned a little bit earlier, you can see those seams that are present kind of on the side and back of the figure. It kind of looks like the back of the head and the whole section with the dorsals is one big piece that is glued into the rest of the figure. And then there's a seam where the tail kind of connects to the body as well. Not that this really means anything to me. I don't care about seams in general, whether it's a realistic figure or not. It's something that's just innate to toy making for the most part. And this is not an expensive figure either, so it doesn't detract from it at all for me. The one area of paint that really pops, however, is the eyes. These are painted in a very bright orange and yellow with a black pupil, but it does sort of create this natural focal point toward Godzilla's face. And for fun, here's what this figure looks like next to his bigger, meaner looking brother. Side by side, these figures look so funny next to each other because I think they really capture the range of types of figures us Godzilla collectors have access to, from the short and stout, stylized versions to the realistic, articulated ones. You really do get kind of everything with Godzilla collectibles, and these two really represent both worlds that I love, which is why I love collecting Godzilla toys. In terms of articulation, this figure does not have any, so it's much more akin to like a mini statue, or like I said, X plus defo reels. I'm used to collecting things that don't have articulation for the most part, so that's not a downside for me, but this sculpt certainly makes up for that lack of articulation. This figure comes in at about 4.7 inches tall, and it is decently wide. It's a pretty chunky figure, and the depth is not too deep, so it's not going to take up a lot of shelf space at all, but it does have a nice density to it. It's lighter than something compared to like a Deferil, but it certainly has a great shelf presence. Now, let's take a look at some size comparisons. I did have a lot of fun putting this side by side with some of my X Plus Deferil figures. If you didn't know better, you might think this actually is a part of those series of figures. So when it comes to Godzilla collectibles, this figure is a home run. What I'm so impressed about is the level of detail that you get for such an affordable price. I feel like it's not often that you get nice looking Godzilla figures like this, whether realistic or stylized, for something that's under $30. Honestly, I am so impressed by this thing. I'm so happy to have it in my collection, and it makes me look forward to future figures like an X Plus Def Real version of -1 Godzilla. When the time comes, I will certainly do a side-by-side of that figure with this one just to see what they look like next to each other. Like I said earlier, the -1 Godzilla design has quickly become one of my favorite versions of Godzilla, so of course I'm eager to see what different companies do with that design in terms of figures and statues. With this particular figure that we're looking at today, this one does not disappoint. I think it is a great interpretation of the character that still stays true to what it's like in the film, while still being its own thing that is very different from other figures that are currently out, like I compared with the monster arts. So if you're a fan of Godzilla -1 and you like this figure as well, I would highly recommend that you get your hands on one while you still can. From what I've seen, they've already sold out in most websites. I know this is directly an import from Japan. I got mine from Big Bad Toy Store, but that pre-order sold out pretty quickly. But it is certainly a figure that is worthy of any collection, a great interpretation of one of the best iterations of Godzilla in my opinion. I'm so happy to have this in my collection. So that's going to be it for the review, but I am curious to know what you guys think. Do you have this figure? And if so, what are your thoughts on it? Leave your comments below. And of course, if you're new to the channel and you like the content, please consider leaving a like, subscribing, and taking a look at my other Godzilla figure content on the channel as well. Lastly, thank you for watching, and have a good one.